Was Jesus unlearned? Who's to say who's unlearned? What's the difference between unlearned and ignorant? How did the Pharisees come up with this in their religious system? Stick around and we're going to find out. During Jesus' ministry, the Pharisees had a lock on everything that was happening, both religiously and sort of running the state too. They had a king. His name was Herod, but he was a puppet king installed by the Romans to watch over the Jews. But he wasn't a true king in a king sense, almost more, I hate to say it to bring England into this, but sort of more like the way England's king is today. Not the true ruler of the state. So the Pharisees had a lock on what was going on, both religiously, and kind of the way society ran. So everybody feared the Pharisees. They controlled the knowledge. And how did they control the knowledge? It's not like it is today. They couldn't go out and buy a Tanakh or a Torah and have it in their own home and read it and study it. They couldn't do that. The Jews had it because they were written in scrolls. So the Jews controlled all this. It was just too expensive. So now this is the plight Jesus was up against. That's why his battles with the Pharisees were so tough, but people feared the Pharisees. If you remember in John 9:23, if you remember the story where the blind man was healed and the Pharisees dragged the parents in and said, hey, what happened? How did he get healed? Was he blind from birth? And the parents just basically said, yeah, he was blind from birth. But what happened, we don't know. Because they had a fear. They had a fear of the Pharisees. If they came out and said, oh, Jesus healed them, the Messiah healed them, they would have been kicked out of the temple and pretty much isolated from society. And they were afraid of that. And that was a lot of what was going on in the time of Jesus. His battles, if you look at almost all his parables, were directed at the Pharisee. That was the whole scope of this battle. So whenever you read a parable and you can't figure it out, start with it's something against the Pharisees, and then you can figure out what he's trying to say. Okay, let's move into learned versus unlearned. Back then, in Jesus' time, the only way to become learned was to grow up under the Pharisees and be taught by them, much the way Paul was. He was brought up under a rabbi called Gamaliel, and he learned at his feet. That's how he learned scripture. So Paul was a master at scripture. So he would have been considered completely learned. Almost like today, if the only way you could learn the Bible, because there's no printed Bible, was to go to seminary school. Well, all the people that went to seminary school would be learned, and the rest of us would be unlearned. But now we kind of turned the tide on that. So let's break down what they were learning back then. They had, to their, what we call now the Old Testament, they had three parts to it, the same way the Old Testament does today. They had the first part, which was called the Torah, the first 5 books, which is called the Torah, or they had another term for it. They called it the Pentateuch. And the second part of it was what they called the writings, and they called it the Ketuvim. And then the third part would be the prophets, which they called the Nevi'im, which is the prophets and the prophetical writings. Today we have the same sort of thing. Our Old Testament is broken down, at least the King James Version. It's broken down into 39 books. The first 17, we call them history. The second 5, or the 5 after that, I should say, we call that the books of wisdom. And then the last 17, we call them the books of the prophecies. So they did a very similar thing back then. Pharisees also had a book they called the Mishnah or Talmud, which was the oral teachings of Moses. Now they claim they are the unwritten, spoken laws, and a lot of them are kind of crazy. The Jews, they put, I believe they do this. They put their left shoe on first, then their right shoe, and then they tie their right shoe and then go back and tie their left shoe. They do like weird things like that, and a lot of these things are the things Jesus was calling out about washing your hands. Remember, he said that transgressed the elders and the ancients by not washing their hands before they ate bread. These are the things that Jesus was fighting with them over, because that's not in God's laws. That's not in the Torah that you wash your hands or you do anything. So I guess, maybe when Moses was leaving the mountain, maybe God said, hey, don't tell him about the shoe, or don't write the shoe thing. Just tell him about it later. I mean, maybe it's something like that. But these are the things that Jesus was fighting about. This is the undercurrent of these battles, that you saw, especially about eating and picking. They were picking the ears of the wheat when they were walking through Jesus with his disciples, when they were walking through the wheat field on the Sabbath day. These are the kind of things that got fought constantly. Okay, let's continue our battles between Jesus and the Pharisees. And this is a shot from John 7:15. And the Jews marveled, saying, how knoweth this man letters, having never learned? Meaning, this was a shot at Jesus, because how do you know these things? Because nobody taught you. Okay, let's move on to Luke 2:46. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them, asking them questions, and all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. This is another incident where they can't figure out how this little boy, when Jesus was a young boy, how he knew all this stuff. Where did this come from? Jesus went on to do some other things. And this is, when I look at if I had to pin down what miracle would make Jesus truly godlike and God himself, what miracle would it be? Would it be raising people from the dead, fixing cleaning up the lepers and all this sort of stuff? To me, it's to do the godlike thing, which is instilling in his disciples the ability to heal and to also to see things that they didn't know, to instill them with knowledge. Just like God did to the prophets, because you got to remember Elijah, Elisha, these guys all raised people from the dead too. So why aren't they God? They're not. But it's the ability to instill that in other people. And I think that's the big thing here. Let's move on, and I'm going to continue on that. Let's move on to Acts 4:13. And I'm going to read this here for you. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. So in other words, they figured out that it was Jesus that instilled this knowledge into them somehow. Jesus was unlearned, but he taught other people that were unlearned. And the difference between learned and unlearned and ignorant, we know what learned and unlearned is, but ignorant would be someone who has heard the oral reciting, because that's what they did every 7 years. They were commanded to do, to read the Torah to the people every 7 years. So ignorant is somebody who has heard the Torah but yet does not understand it. They're considered ignorant people, not unlearned. It's something different. So that's a whole different subject, but I think I'm just going to cut it off at this point. I think we get the message.